Hello and welcome to another Chess Guess video, and today we'll see an example of how Magnus Carlsen dominates his opponents in chess. Of course he doesn't win every game, but he does win often, and he's an amazing player that anybody can learn from. So today you want to try and guess his moves. I won't have as much commentary. I've hidden the moves in the computer analysis. That way you can guess and see if you can pick some of the moves that Magnus Carlsen plays. All right, he had the white pieces, and this is a more recent game played this year. So he's playing against Richard Pert, and let's see how things play out here. So Magnus Carlsen on the move. How do you think he would start a game? Well, h4. And apparently this is the Cadus opening. Cadus opening. You don't see an immediate h4 too often. Now, I did see recently that Magnus Carlsen mentioned that today you can't play the opening lines, the best moves. You have to play something that opponents haven't seen, or don't see often. Change things up because they're all using computers, the top players, and they're finding the best lines and moves with the computer's help. So, not during the game, hopefully. Otherwise, that would be cheating, so don't do that. All right. So here we have h4. What does Magnus's opponent do? Well, he responds in the center. So that's usually a good decision if your opponent is attacking on the side of the board and lets you dominate the center. That's what you should do. But now Magnus doesn't want to give up too much of the center, so he moves here in response. And his opponent plays a good knight developing move. Now what does Magnus do here? See if you can guess. All right. He just plays kind of a passive move that blocks his bishop, but it solidifies the position of that d4 pawn. It kind of just defends it. And bishop to f5. So developing the bishop outside of the pawn chain with the plan of probably pushing here to e6. How does Magnus respond? f3. So I think Magnus is just playing, well, I shouldn't say these are two crazy moves, because this is a common tactic in the Jabava London, where if they develop their bishop here to f5, then you push the pawn, you get ready to push here, and already the bishop has to watch out, because if it retreats, it could be trapped. So room is given for that bishop to retreat, and also to discourage that move, because now the pawn would just be captured, capture, and bishop could capture. All right, what does Magnus do next? He attacks the center with the flank pawn. Opponent responds by defending. And now what do you think Magnus will play? See if you can guess. All right, a common move, if you're pushing the c pawn, the knight usually jumps in behind it here. His opponent responds with a counterattack of the center. And so now what should Magnus play? He attacks in the center. The computer says that's the best move. The response, recapture, and Magnus with the move. He develops the bishop to d3, putting pressure on this unprotected bishop in the center. That way, if black's bishop captures, he could recapture with the queen, and that'll help him develop a piece. So the opponent does capture, and after the recapture, we have Magnus having to respond next to this move. Knight to c6, just developing, putting more pressure on that pawn in the center. Magnus develops his knight, so both sides are just developing pieces at the moment. And now what for Magnus? If he's continuing with the theme of developing, he has to probably figure out what to do with his bishop, maybe. And let me know if you want more or less commentary when I'm doing these chess guess videos. Because I have seen some rather successful videos where there was no commentary. They just move the pieces. So, do you want me to just shut up while I'm playing these videos? Let me know. All right. The king kind of stays in the center here. Interesting move by Magnus. Maybe he's preparing way in advance for the end game. Could be making room for his other rook to move over here and line up on the king. Let's see. Magnus's opponent develops his rook down the c file in case that opens up. And no, Magnus brings his rook here to the center. Perhaps anticipating a trade in the middle. Opponent responds by developing the rook to the half-open file. And now with Magnus to move, where do you think he'll go next? How should he proceed? What would you do if you were in the middle of this game? G3. So he just protects this pawn because there is a possibility of that queen bishop battery picking that off. So now the pawn's protected. The opponent repositions the bishop, now targeting the base of this small pawn chain. That's usually the weak spot, although at the moment it's protected by the knight and the king. Magnus steps over to the side, adding more protection to the base of that pawn chain. And now the game continues with capture in the center. A mistake, according to the computer. Let's see what Magnus does. Will he capture with the queen? No, because the knight is covering. So knight or pawn should recapture. And the pawn captures. And that's usually a good piece of advice, to capture with the lowest valued piece first and work your way up. You don't always have to do that, but in general. All right. Queen adds more pressure, attacks this unprotected pawn here. So what will Magnus play? He ignores that. Instead, launches his bishop forward, threatening to capture this defensive knight around his opponent's king. And after the recapture, the pawns will be broken apart, and things will be looking a little bit open for that king over there. So let's see what happens. The knight retreats, counterattacking the bishop, wanting to avoid that trade. And now Magnus, with the move, what will he do? All right, he retreats back, wanting to keep his bishop, but also targeting this unprotected bishop at the same time. So if you can find moves that accomplish multiple things, that can be advantageous for you. All right, we have a capture. And now a recapture with the knight. So improving the position of this knight, and now that pawn is under attack. So what will Magnus's opponent do? Probably defend the pawn by pushing, but that could be dangerous, because if that pawn pushes forward, there could maybe be a knight sacrifice with a queen attack. First, his opponent attacks, capturing a pawn with check. What does Magnus do here? He brings his rook forward, counterattacking the queen. The queen will have to retreat. But no, a blunder is played. Knight attacks the queen, so a counterattack. What will Magnus do? Will he trade queens? You also have to remember that the rook is attacking this as well, this knight over here, which is protected by the queen at the moment. So let's see how this plays out. Look at that move. Magnus decides to take a knight with check. Now he can go after the queen and then attack the knight. So game continues with capture. Now what does Magnus do? Well, he recovers his queen and he's attacking his opponent's knight, which will give his knight time to run, if that one retreated. But now if we have capture, capture, rook attacks, at least thinking, well, I'm behind, I might as well pick up another pawn and try and use this pawn, passed pawns over here. But king runs and king moves forward, ignoring that pawn. So Magnus captures, forking 2 pawns in the process. His opponent presses forward here. And what does Magnus do? Well, Magnus goes after another pawn. His opponent pushes forward, trying to trade off as many pawns as he can. Capture, capture. Magnus with the move. He delivers a check. And this is where his opponent resigned. So before I turn on the analysis and see how the game could have continued, let's take a look at it. Now Magnus is ahead by what here? A pawn and an extra knight. The king is under attack. Let's look at the game review. Magnus played with 93.1% accuracy versus 85.7% by his opponent. I don't know if you can see that. It might be under my image. But down here at the bottom, well, you probably can't even see that. Let me move my image because this is worth taking a look at. Give me a second. Look at that. Magnus played with 35 at a 3,500 rating level versus 2,700 by his opponent. So, his opponent played okay, but Magnus just dominated, once again. So, one blunder by his opponent. Magnus had 2 mistakes and 1 inaccuracy, but that one mistake was the opening move of h4. So I don't know if I'd call that a mistake. I'd call that messing with your opponent by choosing, not the best opening, but maybe a psychological attack on his opponent by playing h4 with the first move. So let's go back and look and see, how this game could have continued. So we have a check here. What can the king do? I'll turn on the analysis. It looks like the best move would be king up to g7. Well, that allows the knight to capture another pawn, and the computer gives king over to f7 as best. But now you have king up to g4. This pawn is under attack. And Magnus would just steamroll through the through the rest of the game here, pushing a passed pawn. He'll probably try and trade off these rooks. Also, there's this passed pawn over here that could start moving. So it was probably wise for his opponent to resign when he did. All right, as always, feel free to leave comments. I love hearing from viewers and subscribers. Let me know what you think, what can be improved on. Don't be afraid to hurt my feelings. If you have any negative comments, that's fine too. So like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.